Well, welcome to North Shore, especially if you may be visiting or a guest with us this weekend. We're so glad you're here, and I want to give a shout out to those of you who are joining us online. We're glad you're here as well. And before we dive in, just a quick reminder, next weekend, next Sunday after this service right here in this room, we're going to be having our fall family meeting. It's a time for us to come together as a church, as a congregation, all together in one space for worship and prayer, some updates. We approve our budget and we have some vision for the future. And I just want to encourage you to be there. And by the way, if you're a member of North Shore, you got an email or a letter about this, I want to remind you this week to get online and vote to approve the budget. Having a budget's a real important thing. So make sure you find some time to do that this week as well. And we will see you after services next Sunday. And I hope if you're just a guest and want to find out more about our church, come on, dive in, and we'd love for you to be part of that as well. So to get started, I want to tell you about something that happened yesterday morning to me. But before I dive into that, I need to kind of give you a little background because the story really begins this past April when I came to this realization that I was really, really out of shape, like physically just in terrible shape. To be honest with you, I actually realized this a couple years ago, but it wasn't until April I decided to do something about it. But I didn't go back to the gym or buy workout equipment. I didn't try yoga or Pilates or yoga lattes or any of that kind of thing. I did something way more impulsive than that. I signed up to run a half marathon. Now, let me just say, as you giggle about that, it wasn't a full marathon, like I'm not totally insane, but it was a half marathon. And I remember signing up and feeling so proud of myself just for registering, like I had done some major thing in my life. In fact, I came home and I was so excited to tell Nina, like, babe, you'll never guess what I did today. I signed up for a half marathon. Like we should celebrate with like some cake or something, just sort of and celebrate the moment. And she just stared at me and said, but Scotty, you don't run. Which was true at the time. I hadn't gone for a run in like many, many years. And then she said, and a half marathon is over 13 miles. And you have to train for like months to get ready. You have to run almost every day of the week, rain or shine, hot or cold, sick or well. And you don't even run. Like I'm just gonna go back to that point, remind you, which is when I started to have this sort of inner panic, like inner anxiety about the decision I had made. And I started to think, okay, well, then how do I get out of this? Like, can I sign somebody else? Can someone go in my place? How do I get out of this run? But it was too late to get out of it because I'd already paid money to enter the race. More importantly, I'd already told Nina that I had paid money to enter the race. So I was gonna run this half marathon. So the very next day, I downloaded one of those like half marathon training programs, like like a beginner one, right? The very first run was like how to run to your mailbox and back, like very much a beginner's level thing. And I still remember in those first few days, my very first run, and like because all of this was like tracked on my phone, so I still have the recording I could show you. My very first run, it was a disaster. Like it was terrible. I felt terrible. I had like the side cramp and leg pain and my back hurt. I think I stopped to check emails somewhere along the way. Like it was a terrible run. In fact, when I finished, my phone told me that I had run 0.52 miles in 16 minutes, which is 1.8 miles per hour, which is slower than walking, which I have no idea how. I felt like I was running, but somehow I was going slower than the people like walking beside me. But here's the thing, I kept getting up and running. And I kept training early in the morning or late at night after the kids were in bed. I kept running all the way up to yesterday morning, which was the day of my half marathon, yesterday morning. Here's a picture of me like right before the race. There I am about to get started. Like another selfie happening right here. There's a bunch of, everyone's doing this motion. Here's what I really was feeling inside in that moment, just so you know. Yeah, I was really nervous. Like I felt like I was gonna throw up, kind of nervous, because I was just thinking like, I don't know that I can do this. I don't know that I can finish this race. I have no idea like how this is actually gonna go. No idea how it would go. Anyone curious how I actually did in the race? Well, I'm not gonna tell you right now. I'm gonna tell you a little bit later. But before we get to that part of the story, I just wanna pause and ask you to think about your own life for a moment. Maybe not a race you're running, but some other challenge or pressure or struggle, and just ask the question, have you ever found yourself facing a challenge or a struggle or a pressure or a crisis in your life and just felt overwhelmed? Like you just felt like under the weight of the world, like overwhelmed, too much. The road is too long, the hill is too steep, the pressure is too great. Maybe from going through a divorce or navigating a miscarriage or walking through a breakup or a job loss or a difficult health diagnosis. Someone reached out to me this past week and said very kind of vulnerably, I just don't feel connected to God anymore. I feel angry, distant, bitter. I'm just losing heart, they said. Anyone else ever lose heart? I feel like I'm not sure, I want to keep doing this. Last week we talked about how in the years of the pandemic, it revealed gaps in our faith, flaws in our discipleship, and it has some significant ones. It's kind of what we're working through this fall. But it's also left people feeling disheartened, disillusioned, discouraged, disappointed. And maybe you're one of those people right now. And it makes you wonder, it makes me wonder, what would Jesus say to people like that? What would Jesus say to a community going through a season where at the end of the day, we're just feeling like we're losing faith or we're losing heart? Well, I think the best way to answer that question is actually go back to the words of Jesus, these very unique ones, the one place in the Bible where Jesus speaks to actual churches. Like if you know the Bible, you may know in the Gospels, Jesus talks to his disciples about the church, but only in one place, only in the last book of the Bible, this book called The Revelation of Jesus Christ, does Jesus speak to real live churches. Many of them struggling with that same sense of pressure, weight, overwhelmed, disillusioned, discouraged, losing heart, which is part of what this series, Dear Church, that we're in right now is all about. What would Jesus say to the church today, especially to the ones that are losing heart? Now, as you may remember from last week, week one of the series, reading through the book of Revelation can be, let's just say, a strange experience. It's filled, as you may know, with heavenly visions and bizarre creatures. We actually, by the way, side note, we had kind of a bizarre creature moment last week here in this service. Some of you may have noticed last week in the 10:30 service, a live bat got in the room and ended up on stage, like right over here, like this group over here. They remember this moment over here and was crawling during the message towards me. A live bat crawling towards the pastor during a message on Revelation. If that's not a sign of the end times, I don't know what it is, okay? And just so you know, the bat has been humanely taken care of and the building has since been debatted. So everybody's safe. But most people, they go to a book like Revelation and they kind of get stuck on the symbols, the creatures, the images, and rightly so. It's strange, can be difficult to interpret. But as we talked about last week, the word apocalypse, which we translate as the word revelation, simply means to unveil, to pull back the curtain, to reveal a truth that's been hidden or is hard to see. That's what Revelation's doing. It's trying to unveil and reveal a truth that's been hidden or hard to see. And even more importantly to understanding this book as a whole is to remember it's a personal letter. Like this isn't a blog post like thrown out to the world that decoding the end times. It's a personal letter from the Apostle John to a group of 7 churches across 7 cities in this area of what is now Turkey. This is that map. John writing from this island called Patmos where he had been banished for life as an exile, a traitor to Rome. And he writes these letters to these Christians that he loves, he cares about. He wants to see them grow in their faith. Those in Ephesus and Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And as I said last week, we're gonna get to know all of these churches really well over these weeks. Really well. But these are the words of a pastor who cares about people. And we saw this firsthand in that letter last week to the church in Ephesus. Remember Ephesus, the church that was doing everything right? They did all the right things. They believed all the right things, but they had forsaken their love for Jesus. Somehow the programs replaced the passion. The activity replaced the intimacy, and they lost their way. Because here's the thing, if you don't love Jesus or at least want to love Jesus, nothing else that this whole church thing is about is gonna matter. It's not gonna matter. And so we're gonna continue to dive into these churches, but I wanna keep going. There's 6 more letters, 6 more messages. And let me just warn you now, kind of a preview for the coming weeks. Jesus is gonna throw some shade over the next 3 weeks, okay? Jesus has some hard, challenging words. This is one of those series where church attendance tends to go down, okay? Because these words are not written for people struggling with their beliefs or behavior out there. They're written to people in here. In fact, I got a note from someone after last Sunday that said, I'm so excited we're teaching on Revelation. People out there need to hear this. And yes, they do. But here's the thing, Jesus isn't talking to them. He's talking to you, and he's talking to me. Like one of the phrases you'll see in all 7 letters, it gets repeated all 7 times, this, whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Not to your crazy neighbors, but to the churches, to the people who are trying to follow Jesus, to you and to me, which brings us to this second letter. And it's a letter I'm so glad that Jesus inspired John to write, because it's written to people struggling to be faithful, struggling under pressure. Revelation 2, starting in verse 8, Jesus starts this way: to the angel of the church in Smyrna write. Now, before we go on, I just want to give you a quick bit of background on the city of Smyrna, because it's going to help us understand what Jesus says through John in these next few verses. Now, just so you know, Smyrna, like Ephesus, was a port city on the west coast of what is now Turkey. You can see it right here. And you can imagine, because it's so close, these are rival cities, vying for which city is the most prominent city in the Roman world, which is the best, who's first, really. And the Smyrnans, I think that's what you call them. Does anybody know the Smyrnans? We'll just go with it. The Smyrnans had printed on their currency this phrase, first city in Asia. As if to say, take that, Ephesus, like we're first, like no way, it's us. And just so you know, it was a beautiful city, one of the most beautiful cities in the ancient world. Historians imagine that it looks something like this. I mean, this is like out of Lord of the Rings or something. It's a beautiful, beautiful ancient city. In fact, it was known as the crown of Asia. You just want to remember that word crown, we'll come back to it. But the city of Smyrna had also been through great hardship. In 600 BC, so 600 years before the life of Jesus, it was destroyed, completely destroyed. And then 300 years later, it was reborn, rebuilt again. So they understood loss and rebirth, which brings us to the words Jesus said to this church. He said, these are the words of him who is the first. Kind of a funny word to say to the city that thinks they're first. I am the first and the last, the one who died and came to life again. Again, this church, this city knows all about these kind of stories. And then he goes on, I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of a synagogue of Satan. By the way, if this sounds strange, don't worry, we'll come back to that in a few moments. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you into prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. If you got a Bible with you, flag the 10 days. We'll come back to that one too. And then Jesus says, be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's, here's our word, crown. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. Now, before we can even begin to understand what this means for us, we have to start with what this meant to those who were following Jesus in the city of Smyrna. And the first thing that would stand out in their mind was, unlike Ephesus, Jesus doesn't begin this letter with a list of their accomplishments. I know your deeds, your perseverance, your hard work. He doesn't start out with their accomplishments. Jesus here begins with their suffering, their struggle, the trouble, the pain, the mess. He says, I know your afflictions. And by the way, some versions in this will say, I know your tribulation. Now, some of you know that word tribulation is kind of an interesting word. It's one that many Christians associate with the end times and this potential 7-year period of global struggle or tribulation that will happen either before or after Jesus returns. And we're not going to get into that at all today, but we are going to dive into the tribulation, the idea of a rapture, all the wild end time stuff at our first Wednesday experience on October 5th. Now, First Wednesdays, if you're new, they're new to us as well. We're starting just next month. They happen to be on the first Wednesday of every month. And the goal of a First Wednesday experience is for us just to dive deeper into Scripture, dive deeper into encountering the Holy Spirit, and grow stronger in our faith. Here's what's one, the very first one. Wolfgang and I are gonna be co-teaching this one on Revelation, and you'll be voting on who has the right view of the end times, okay? So I'm just kidding, we're not gonna do that, don't worry. But I would encourage you, mark your calendars, come out, be part of that with us October 5th. But here in this text in Revelation 2, the word Jesus uses for affliction or tribulation is a real common word in the New Testament. It's this Greek word, thlipsis. Everybody say that, thlipsis. It's a real interesting word. It doesn't have anything to do with the end times or dragons or live bats on stage. It's not that kind of word. Thlipsis just means weightiness, pressure. That moment in life when you feel like you got the weight of the world bearing down on your shoulders, that's thlipsis. And the truth is, every follower of Jesus is going to experience this at some point. In fact, Jesus once told his disciples, you know this verse, in this world you will have trouble. That's the same word. You will have thlipsis, trouble, affliction, pain, problems. Aren't you glad you came to church today, right? Like, oh my goodness, where is this message going? And the church in Smyrna was no exception to this. In fact, the pressure on Christians in that city was as great or greater than any other city in Asia because Smyrna was fiercely loyal to Caesar and to Rome. They were the first city to build a temple to what's called the Dea Roma, the goddess of Rome. And they ended up building temples to Caesar Augustus and Emperor Tiberius and Empress Lydia and even a temple to the Roman Senate. They were all out on Rome. In fact, there was an adage in Smyrna, Rome first in all things. Rome first in all things. That's how you made your way through life. Just put Rome first. And everybody did that, like everybody did that, except for the small community of Christ followers who refused to put Rome first, who refused to swear their allegiance to Caesar. And here's what you need to know about that. There were great costs to these choices. For example, if you refused to worship Caesar, you couldn't find a job or run a business in town. Because in that day, if you wanted to work or run a business, you had to get Roman approval. And the way you got Roman approval was by going to one of those Roman temples, throwing some incense and a fire at an altar, and saying out loud, Caesar Kurios, which means Caesar is Lord. And then they would document this public act of allegiance by putting a mark or a stamp like ink on your hand or on your forehead, just so if you went to get work or wanted to start a business, this was like your business license. The mark on your hand that said, I swore allegiance to Caesar and now I can have a job. Just imagine being a Christian in that day and having to choose whether or not to get the mark on your hand. Like, do I put Jesus first? Or do I go to the temple and say, Caesar is Lord, but I'm able to have a job and provide for my family? Like, what am I supposed to do? Do you feel the weight, the pressure that choice would create? By the way, the Christians that day had a name for this mark on the hand or the forehead. They called it the mark of the beast. Anyone else ever heard that before? And I hate to break it to some of you, but just so you know, it has nothing to do with a vaccine or a microchip or your social security number. Like, that's not what this is about. The mark of the beast was choosing to put Rome first. And here's the thing, we do this too. All the time. Our Rome is just maybe our preferred political ideology or consumerism or individualism. Maybe your mark is just saying me first. Like, I'll go to church, I'll go to a Bible study, but it's me first. That's the mark of the beast. It's anything you choose to put before Jesus. But the church in Smyrna was resisting the pressure. And as a result, they were out of work, living in poverty, unable to make money. And even worse, there was this segment of the Jewish community in town that began to publicly shame the Christian church and even inform on them, turn them over to the Romans. That's why John refers to those particular Jews as the synagogue of Satan. It kind of sounds kind of scary and demonic, but remember, the word Satan, the name Satan just means the accuser. He's saying, you're part of the group that's accusing Christians of disloyalty to Rome, and as a result, the Christians are being imprisoned and executed. Now, all this should help explain why Jesus says, I know your poverty, meaning I know you resisted taking the mark, and now you're out of work, you're out of money. I know it's cost you. That's why he says, I know about the slander, the accusations, the shaming. I know about the imprisonment. and that some of you are gonna pay with your life for being faithful. And here's the thing, all that pressure would go away, would get better if they just decided to go with the flow. They just decided we don't need to stand out anymore. It's just a little incense in an altar. It's just a few words we say. We don't have to mean it. We just have to go and say it. And then we can have work. We can have jobs. What difference does it really make? And even though we don't live in a world where we face the same threat of physical persecution, and we should be grateful for that, we live in a world that says, just do what Rome does. Just do what the world does. Stop standing out. Just go with the flow at work or at school or when you're dating or in your approach to money or politics or sexuality. Just go with it. Just blend in. And when you don't, and some of you know this, when you don't, it costs you. It costs you. To which Jesus says, and I want you to hear this, I know it's cost you. I know about the promotion you didn't get because you wouldn't compromise your standards. I know about the relationship you lost because you wanted to be sexually pure in that relationship. I know about the social circles that exclude you because you won't live or act that way. I know about the teacher or professor that thinks you're naive or ignorant or uneducated because you put your faith first. I know. He knows. And just so you know, he also knows, and this is important for us to realize, he also knows that the real enemy in all this isn't the culture or the government or the Democrats or the Republicans. The real enemy is a spiritual one. Remember John, it's interesting, John didn't say the Romans will put some of you into prison. That's what actually happened. He said the devil will put you in prison. Why? Because the Apostle Paul once said, our battle is not against flesh and blood, friends. The enemy is not the people out there or the school system or the government. The enemy is a spiritual one, and the battle is a spiritual one. The devil doesn't cause sickness or suffering, but he uses it to tempt you to believe that God doesn't give a flip about you or your struggle. That's the real battle. So what does Jesus say to this church that's struggling, they're out of work, being put in jail, losing their lives? In the world's eyes, if you drove by this church, you think that church is losing. Like it's a mess. It's not growing, it's not doing well. Don't be part of that one. Looks like it's losing. What does Jesus say? Well, the first thing I want to point out to you is what Jesus doesn't say. This is fascinating. Remember last week, or he doesn't say this unique phrase, but I have this against you. You might remember that from last week if you were here. He told the church in Ephesus, but I hold this against you. You have forsaken your first love. And it's part of an ongoing pattern in all of these letters. He always starts by saying, I know. And he lists out some strength or strength sign of character, some positive aspect of the church. But then he always follows that up with, I hold this against you. And he lists a weakness, a flaw, a failure. And this happens, again, in almost every letter. You see this pattern. I know, but I hold this against you. I know, but I hold this against you. Not this letter. Not to Smyrna. Jesus doesn't say, but I hold this against you, because in no place in this letter does he admonish or critique or rebuke. Why? Because they're doing everything right. Even though it looks like they're losing, even though it looks like it's a mess, even though they're struggling and suffering, they're doing everything right. Why? By just being faithful in their suffering. And by the way, that's all Jesus actually asks of you. And then to encourage them to keep going, he gives them two really simple commands. You're not gonna have to use a theological textbook to interpret these. These are real simple. Verse 10, he says this, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And I think this is especially important in our day because we're living in a time, in a season where we're just being overwhelmed with and consumed by fear on all sides. It's such an important reminder because we're consumed by fear. Fear that the markets will keep declining. Fear that inflation is gonna keep going up. Fear that the culture is too corrupt. Fear that the government's too broken. Fear that your health may not improve. Fear that you may not find that spouse. Fear that your kids will struggle. Fear that you won't get into the right school. Fear. It's everywhere. In fact, if there were a national fear index in our day, it would be as high and to the right as it's ever been. And everything you read, every article that pops up in your news feed is designed to stoke fear, even the Christian sounding ones. But Jesus starts by saying, don't be afraid. Whatever else you do, don't let your life be driven by fear. Not because the world is perfectly safe, but because the temptation to compromise always starts with fear. Did you know that? It always starts with fear. I'm afraid that I won't get that promotion, so I'll compromise my standards. I'm afraid I won't find the right person to marry, so I'll compromise my beliefs around sexuality. I'm afraid I won't be accepted, so I'll compromise my standards in some way or another. Temptation always starts with fear. Fear. But remember, whatever you're afraid of, here's the good news, it isn't gonna have the last word in your life. Did you know that? Remember that detail about suffering persecution for 10 days? That's kind of a weird thing. Kind of sounds like a weatherman. Like, hey, for 10 days, you're gonna have bad weather, but then it's gonna be really good after that. Like, that's not what he's doing, okay? Numbers in Revelation are used symbolically. And 10 is a number that means completion or completeness, which means this suffering will end. It has an end point. It's gonna be finished. How do I know? Because Jesus is the first and the last. Remember that detail? In Greek, the Alpha and Omega. He's the beginning and the end, which means whatever you're afraid of, no matter how great or how dangerous, it's really, really small compared to Jesus. I know that addiction feels big. I know that shame feels big. I know that secret feels big. I know that struggle feels big. I know that health problem feels big, but it is not. Jesus is. And he didn't say, in this world, you will have trouble. And then look down and say, gosh, and that really sucks, doesn't it? No. Look what he says in John. In this world, you will have trouble, but don't lose heart. I have overcome the world. So don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Church, can we agree that we need to work on this? Can we agree that we need to spend time checking the fear that comes up in our soul every single day when we look at the world or the news or whatever our circumstances and actually begin to surrender that fear to the power of Jesus? Don't be afraid. You don't have to be afraid. He's the first and the last. He's big enough. That's first. And then second, another real simple command. He says, be faithful. Also in verse 10. Don't be afraid and be faithful. And I love this because it doesn't say be successful, be influential, be whatever it may be. He just says be faithful. And by the way, being faithful is not a way to prove yourself or go out and try to earn God's love or favor in your life. Faithfulness is a way to find and experience and be secure in God's love in your life. In fact, when we're faithful in struggling or suffering, somehow, and I know this is kind of a mystery, somehow in that moment, we find ourselves closer to God and more secure in him. Just ask someone who's been faithful in a time of hardship. They'll tell you the mystery. While they would not want to go through it, in those moments, they found themselves more deeply secured in God. And that took them through the difficulty. It brought them through it. And by the way, that's what happened in Smyrna. Did you know that? Even though it looked like they were losing, they were winning, they were overcoming. How do I know? Because get this, out of the 7 churches in Revelation, this is the only church that still exists today. Did you know that? The ancient city of Smyrna is now the Turkish city of Izmir, and it still has a vibrant church presence. It always has. Not because they've had the best preaching or the best programs. They just said, we're not gonna give in to fear, and we're gonna be faithful to Jesus no matter what. And it's the only church that's still standing. Just by being faithful. Because by the way, that's how you finish first in the kingdom of God. Did you know that? That's how you finish first. That's how you receive the crown, the victor's crown. Which interestingly enough, back to my own story, is kind of the lesson I learned in this journey to run 13 miles. And no, just so you know, yesterday morning, I didn't come in first, not even close. In fact, a lot of people ran a lot faster than me. In fact, here's a picture of me when I was running, getting passed by a guy in a shark outfit. Well, that was a low moment, okay? That was a challenging moment. Like I didn't know if I would still make it when the shark passed me, okay? But somewhere along the way, it's funny, I know, I get it. Yeah. Slower than the shark. That's your pastor. Anyway, somewhere along the way, I realized this, it was just so obvious. Winning has nothing to do with how fast I run or what place I finish. Winning was about being faithful every day I had to train. Winning was about getting up early to run when I wanted to be in bed sleeping. Winning was about not giving into that temptation to want to give up. Winning was just about being faithful when nobody else was looking and no medals were passed around, all the way to the finish. And I did actually finish. I finished the race like 13 hours later. I finished the race. So, in fact, I have a picture of what I look like at the end. This is me in my triumphal finish right there. Yep, that's about it. My kids were right there laughing at me, just so you know. But here's my point, and it's a real simple one you can take with you today. This is the point of kind of the whole message. Faithfulness is the only finish line that matters. Okay? Faithfulness is the only finish line that matters. Not making more money or having that second house or raising perfect kids or having perfect circumstances. Faithfulness is the only finish line that actually matters. And by the way, just so you know, in the kingdom of God, there's no reward for finishing first. Doesn't exist. The victor's crown goes to those who are faithful, regardless of what place they finish. Especially when the thlipsis, the weight of the world is bearing down on them. Some of you know Dave and Annette Holscher and their 3 kids. Their family has been part of our church for a long, long time, a wonderful family. And they've been living through a season of just struggle and pressure, the world bearing down on them. In 2013, as many of you know, Annette was diagnosed with lung cancer. And by 2015, it had spread to her brain. And for years, she's been in and out of treatment all over the country, battling this disease, fighting literally for her life. And you'd think somewhere in those years, she would want to give up. Somewhere in those years, she'd stop being faithful. Somewhere she'd lose hope in Jesus, but not Annette. If you know her, you know just how faithful she's been. I've been on kind of the family email list for several years, and even when there's bad news or hard news, she reminds you just how faithful and good God is. Well, just recently, the cancer worsened, and they stopped treatment. And friends and family have gathered around because it's that time. And I was so blessed to spend a little time with her and her family last Sunday. We talked, we laughed, we remembered, we celebrated communion together. And it occurred to me in that moment as I sat by her bedside, she's not losing the real battle. She's winning. She's always been winning. Because this life that we're living, friends, it's just the training program. It's just the short run. Real life comes after this life. The real rewards come not for building the best career or making the most money or having the nicest stuff, but for being faithful under pressure. You know, Annette's story reminds me of the words the Apostle Paul wrote just before the end of his life on earth. He was in prison, he was struggling, the weight of the world on him. And he didn't say, look at all the churches I planted, or look at all the money I raised, look at all the influence I've had. He said these words, and many of you know these: I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, and here it is, I have remained faithful. That's the finish line. It's the only finish line that matters. How do I know? Just look at Jesus. He knew affliction. He knew poverty. He knew slander. He knew accusation and imprisonment and death. He knew what it was like to have the weight of the world bearing down on his shoulders as he carried the cross to Calvary. And as he did, everybody pointed and laughed. They thought he was losing. But he wasn't. He was winning. And on the 3rd day, when he walked to that tomb, Jesus won. Why? Because he was faithful every step of the way, all the way to the finish. So question for you, and with this we'll close. What does a faithful next step look like in your life today? What does a faithful next step look in your life today? Maybe it's in your relationship or your marriage. Maybe it's something around work or career or finances. Maybe it's something as simple as a hard conversation you need to have or a person you need to forgive. What does a faithful next step look like? Not successful or profitable or comfortable, just faithful. What's that next step look like? We're gonna take a moment right now and talk to God about that. So if you close your eyes, bow your heads. And some of you right now, as we pray, just in the quiet of your heart, some of you need to wake up to the fact that you've been chasing all the wrong finish lines. You've made your life about success or reputation or influence or having people think a certain way about you, whatever it may be. And Jesus right now is inviting you to come back to that original commitment to be faithful, to point your life towards the finish line of faithfulness, just trusting in Him one day at a time, one decision at a time. So I want to give you a chance to do that right now. Nobody's looking, the heads are bowed. If you want to commit today, that you want to commit today to a new finish line, the finish line of being faithful in your marriage, with your money, whatever it may be. If you want to commit today, Jesus, I want to be faithful to you. If you want to make that commitment, just raise your hand right now. Jesus, I just want to commit. I want to be faithful with the challenge I'm facing. I love those. Thank you for that hand. The burden I'm feeling, thank you for that hand. It's a powerful moment right now because you're doing what the enemy wants to keep you from doing. We're saying, Jesus, I want to put you first, no matter what the cost. And Jesus, we do together want to put you first today in every way in our lives. We want to put you first. Why? Because you put us first. You've been faithful to us. And there's nothing in this world that can overcome your power, your grace, your goodness, your faithfulness to us. So we're going to sing and celebrate the power you have even over the darkest parts of our life, Jesus. Pray this in your name, and everybody said, amen.
Hey, thanks so much for watching.
Please be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content.
Yep, and click right here for more content we think you might like.
Seriously,
Click it.
do it right now. Show them again, Kiki.